For 3 years, I told myself I was being loyal. For 3 years, I told myself I was protecting the company. For 3 years, I stayed silent because silence felt safer than asking the wrong question. Then I opened an email that was never meant for me, and I realized I hadn't been protecting anything. I had been helping someone commit a crime. I work on the 8th floor of a commercial office building on South Wacker Drive in downtown Chicago, Illinois. The building has a glass lobby, private security at the front desk, and the kind of quiet that only exists in corporate offices where people believe paperwork can keep them safe. Our company handles logistics compliance for mid-sized manufacturing firms across the Midwest. We audit shipments, manage reporting, and certify that clients are following federal and state regulations. On paper, we are a risk management firm. In reality, we are a pressure cooker that runs on deadlines and deniability. When I was hired, my title was Compliance Operations Manager. I reported directly to my boss, David Keller, the Director of Regulatory Services. He worked out of a corner office on the same floor, glass walls, white desk, framed certifications on the wall. He had been with the company for over a decade. People trusted him. Executives deferred to him. New hires were told, explicitly, that if David approved something, it was approved. I believed that. The first time I covered for him was small. It was late 2021, right before Thanksgiving. We were finalizing a compliance packet for a client based in Joliet, Illinois, a metal fabrication company that shipped parts to Indiana and Ohio. One of the shipment records didn't match the supporting documentation. The dates were off. The weight totals didn't reconcile. When I flagged it, David told me to adjust the entry and move on. He said the client had sent an updated file verbally and hadn't uploaded it yet. He said the discrepancy would be corrected later. He said delays would cost the company penalties. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten me. He just spoke like this was routine. I corrected the entry. That was it. No alarms. No warnings. The file went out. The client passed their audit. Everyone moved on. A month later, it happened again. Different client. Different inconsistency. This time, a missing chain of custody document for a shipment that crossed state lines from Wisconsin into Illinois. I asked for the document. David told me it was misplaced and that the shipment had already cleared inspection. He asked me to attach a prior version and label it as corrected. I hesitated. He noticed. He told me that compliance wasn't about perfection. It was about interpretation. He told me federal auditors didn't want to see chaos. They wanted clean narratives. He told me he'd take responsibility if anything came back. I updated the file. By early 2022, this had become normal. I didn't see it as covering up violations. I saw it as smoothing errors, fixing timing issues, helping operations catch up to paperwork. The language mattered. It always does. In February 2022, we expanded a contract with a client in Fort Wayne, Indiana, a chemical distributor that shipped regulated materials. That meant increased reporting, stricter oversight, and more eyes on our work. It also meant more pressure from leadership to keep everything clean. David started routing more files through me. He would mark emails as urgent. He would forward documents late at night. He would ask me to sanitize reports before they went to compliance review. That word should have stopped me. It didn't. I told myself I wasn't the one making the decisions. I told myself I was just implementing guidance from my director. I told myself that if there was something truly illegal, someone else would catch it. That was the lie I lived with. The first time I noticed intent was subtle. It was a spreadsheet attached to an internal email, not a client-facing document. The spreadsheet tracked audit exposure across several clients. There were columns labeled adjusted totals and reported totals. The numbers didn't match. I assumed it was a working document. When I asked David about it, he closed the door to his office. He told me those were internal risk projections. He told me not to worry about it. He told me that executives didn't need to see preliminary data that could cause confusion. I stopped asking. I was no longer just fixing errors. I was altering timestamps. I was re-uploading documents with modified metadata. I was replacing attachments before they went to external reviewers. Every time, David told me it was temporary. Every time, he said the underlying facts were accurate. Every time, he said the company couldn't afford scrutiny over administrative noise. I knew enough about compliance to understand the line was getting thinner. I also knew enough about corporate culture to understand what happens to people who challenge leadership without airtight proof. So I stayed quiet. In August 2022, we had a compliance review scheduled with an external auditor based in Cleveland, Ohio. They flew into Chicago and spent 3 days on site. We booked conference room 8C, the one with the long table and no windows. David led the meetings. I supported him. I provided documents. I answered procedural questions. At one point, one of the auditors asked about a discrepancy involving a shipment that passed through O'Hare International Airport before being routed to Toronto, Canada. The documentation showed clearance before arrival. I froze. David answered without hesitation. He said the system logged clearance at the point of authorization, not physical arrival. He said the timestamps reflected approval, not movement. The auditor nodded and moved on. That was the moment I realized David had rehearsed these explanations. This wasn't reactive. This was prepared. After the auditors left, David thanked me. He told me I handled myself well. He told me I was valuable. He told me people like me kept companies running. I went home that night to my apartment in Logan Square and stared at my laptop without opening it. I didn't feel proud. I didn't feel scared. I felt numb. By early 2023, the scale changed. We onboarded a multinational client headquartered in Houston, Texas, with manufacturing facilities in Monterrey, Mexico. The compliance requirements were complex. Cross-border regulations, customs filings, federal oversight from multiple agencies. The volume of documentation tripled. David created a parallel workflow. Certain files were marked internal only. Certain communications were routed exclusively through him. I was instructed to bypass standard compliance checks for pre-cleared shipments. I asked who pre-cleared them. He said legal had signed off. I never saw the legal sign-off. In March 2023, I traveled to Dallas, Texas, for a regional compliance conference. David attended as well. We stayed at the same hotel near Dallas Love Field Airport. During one of the breakout sessions, a speaker discussed enforcement actions involving falsified compliance records. The examples were uncomfortably familiar. That night, in the hotel bar, David joked about how regulators loved paperwork more than truth. He laughed. I didn't. When we returned to Chicago, the pace accelerated. Files came in marked urgent. Changes were expected immediately. Questions were discouraged. David began copying fewer people on emails. I became the bottleneck. I was also becoming traceable. That realization hit me slowly. My login, my timestamps, my edits. Every corrected document carried my digital footprint. David approved them, but I executed them. I told myself it didn't matter. If anything happened, the company would protect itself. David would take responsibility. That's what directors do. I was wrong. The email that changed everything arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in late April 2024. I remember the date because it was the same day our building fire alarm malfunctioned and we had to evacuate into the street. When we came back upstairs, my inbox was flooded. One message stood out. It was addressed to David, not me. It came from an external email address I didn't recognize. The subject line referenced a client file I managed. Somehow I was copied. That alone was unusual. I opened it because I needed to know if it affected my workload. It wasn't long. It didn't use coded language. It didn't hedge. It laid out exactly what had been happening. The sender referenced specific shipments, specific alter records, and specific instructions David had given to align documentation with approved outcomes. It discussed exposure. It discussed timelines. It discussed keeping adjustments internal until after regulatory review windows closed. It explicitly stated that certain records had been falsified to avoid triggering audits. There was no ambiguity, no interpretation, no plausible deniability. This wasn't compliance gray area. This was intentional fraud. I didn't respond. I didn't forward it. I didn't close it. I sat at my desk on the 8th floor, looking at the Chicago River through the glass, and understood that everything I had told myself for 3 years had been wrong. I wasn't protecting the company. I was protecting a crime. And now I was documented. David came out of his office 15 minutes later. He saw my expression. He knew. He asked me to come in and close the door. What he said next didn't matter as much as what he didn't say. He didn't deny it. He didn't express surprise. He talked about risk. He talked about exposure. He talked about loyalty. He asked me to delete the email. That was the moment the story stopped being about silence. Because once someone asks you to erase evidence, the line disappears completely. I told him I needed time. I told him I had another meeting. I walked back to my desk, heart steady, hand shaking just enough to notice. I forwarded the email to my personal device. Then I sat there and waited because I didn't yet know what to do, only that I couldn't unknow what I'd read. The company was still operating. Phones were ringing. People were laughing in the break room. On the surface, nothing had changed. But underneath it, a clock had started. And it wasn't going to stop. I didn't delete the email. I didn't tell anyone I hadn't deleted it either. For the rest of that afternoon, I did exactly what I always did. I answered emails. I reviewed files. I approved minor corrections. From the outside, nothing about my behavior changed. Inside the company, that mattered. Deviations get noticed. Calm looks like compliance. At 5:42 p.m., I shut down my computer, picked up my bag, and took the elevator down from the 8th floor to the lobby. The security desk nodded as I passed. Outside, the air along South Wacker Drive smelled like exhaust and rain. I walked west toward Union Station instead of heading straight for the bus, just to put distance between myself and the building. On the train home, I reread the email on my phone. Slower this time, line by line. The sender was a consultant based in St. Louis, Missouri. A former compliance advisor, David, had worked with years earlier, according to the signature block. The tone wasn't angry. It wasn't panicked. It was precise, almost administrative. It referenced 3 clients by name. It listed altered shipment records. It mentioned internal tracking spreadsheets. It stated plainly that the actions taken could constitute wire fraud and obstruction if reviewed by federal authorities. It asked David how long the alignment process was expected to continue. There was no reply from David in the thread, just that one message. I understood then why he wanted it gone. It wasn't just incriminating. It was informed. That night, in my apartment, I opened my laptop and started pulling copies of files I had touched over the last 18 months. I didn't download everything. That would have been obvious. I was selective. I chose files connected to the clients mentioned in the email. I chose versions with edit histories. I chose internal spreadsheets that didn't go out to clients. I saved them to an encrypted drive I had originally purchased for tax records. I labeled the folder something generic. Utilities. That's what I called it. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, David wasn't in his office. His assistant said he was in meetings all day. That wasn't unusual, but his calendar was blocked in a way I hadn't seen before. External calls. Executive reviews. No details. Around noon, I received an email from Compliance Operations requesting a status update on several files. That was normal. What wasn't normal was the sender. It wasn't one of our usual reviewers. It was someone from internal audit. Internal audit didn't usually interact with my team directly. They worked through directors. I responded with a neutral update. Files in progress. Pending confirmations. An hour later, I got a meeting invite. Title: Documentation review location. Conference room, 12A time. Friday, 9 a.m. Conference room, 12A was on the 12th floor, where internal audit and legal were housed. I had been there once before, years earlier, for a routine walkthrough. This didn't feel routine. I didn't tell David about the invite. He didn't mention it either. On Friday morning, I arrived early. I wore the same navy blazer I wore to audits. Neutral, professional, non-threatening. I brought my laptop and a printed notebook, even though everything was digital. People trust paper more than screens. Conference room 12A overlooked the north side of the city. You could see the river bend toward Lake Michigan. The room had a long rectangular table, a wall-mounted screen, and a speakerphone in the center. When I walked in, 2 people were already seated. One was Karen Liu, senior manager in internal audit. I recognized her from previous company-wide meetings. The other was a man I didn't know, mid-40s, dark suit, no visible company badge. They asked me to close the door. Karen explained that this was an informal documentation review. She said they were conducting a routine audit of compliance workflows related to recent client expansions. She said my name had come up as a primary operator on several files. The man introduced himself as Mark Reynolds. He said he was with outside counsel. He didn't specify the firm. They asked me to walk them through my process. So I did. I explained how files came in, how discrepancies were flagged, how corrections were approved. I described my role accurately, carefully, without embellishment. I did not accuse anyone. I did not volunteer conclusions. I answered the questions that were asked. Mark asked about escalation paths. When did I raise issues? Who approved deviations? What documentation existed for approvals? I told them approvals came from my director. I told them approvals were often verbal. I told them documentation wasn't always retained once files were finalized. Karen asked if that aligned with company policy. I said no. There was a pause. Then Karen asked if I had ever been instructed to alter records in ways that contradicted source documentation. I took a breath. I said yes. Mark asked who instructed me. I said my director. They asked if I had documentation supporting that. This was the moment. The line I had been standing near for 3 years was now directly in front of me. I told them I had emails. I didn't say I had copies at home. I didn't say I had backed anything up. I said I could provide examples. Karen asked me to forward them to a secure internal address. I asked for a clarification on scope. I asked whether this was protected under internal reporting policy. I asked whether legal was involved. Mark answered that I was speaking with legal. I forwarded 3 emails. Not the one from the consultant. Not yet. These were internal messages from David instructing adjustments. Enough to establish a pattern. Not enough to show intent. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. When it ended, they thanked me for my cooperation and told me not to discuss the review with anyone else. I went back to my desk. David still hadn't spoken to me. That afternoon, I noticed subtle changes. My system access lagged. Certain shared folders were read-only. A few files I had edited recently were locked. This wasn't retaliation. It was containment. On Monday, the compliance review escalated. I received a calendar invite for a process clarification meeting. This time it included HR, internal audit, and legal. David was included as well. The meeting took place in conference room 8B on our floor. Neutral territory. David arrived late. He looked tired. He didn't make eye contact with me. Legal asked him to explain deviations in documentation practices. He spoke confidently. He framed adjustments as efficiency measures. He referenced verbal client confirmations. He emphasized outcomes over procedure. They asked him whether he had authorized alterations that contradicted original records. He said no. They asked whether he had instructed his team to bypass compliance checks. He said no. They asked whether he had received any external communications discussing intentional manipulation of records. He paused. Then he said he didn't recall. I watched him lie in real time. After the meeting, legal requested follow-up documentation. Deadlines were set. Access was further restricted. By midweek, outside counsel expanded their review. More emails were requested. More files were pulled. IT was notified to preserve data. That was the first time the word preservation was used. On Thursday, 2 IT security specialists came to the 8th floor. They wore company badges, but they weren't from our usual team. They went office to office, documenting devices. When they reached David's office, they stayed longer. On Friday, David didn't come in. An email went out from HR stating he was on administrative leave, pending review. The wording was neutral. The implications were not. No announcement was made to the department. No explanation was given. Work continued. I continued working. The following week, I was called back to conference room 12A. This time, there were 3 people present: Karen, Mark, and a woman who introduced herself as a forensic accountant. They had questions about specific transactions. They had timelines. They had spreadsheets I recognized. They asked whether I had ever been instructed to backdate approvals. I said yes. They asked whether I understood the regulatory implications at the time. I said I understood there were risks. They asked why I hadn't reported concerns earlier. I said I trusted leadership. They asked if I had retained copies of any communications beyond what I had already provided. I hesitated. Then I told the truth. I told them about the email. The room changed. Mark asked me to forward it immediately. I told him I couldn't. Not from my work device. He asked where it was. I told him I had forwarded it to my personal account the day I received it. Karen nodded. She asked me to send it from there. I did. No one spoke while they read it. When Mark finished, he closed his laptop. He said this review was no longer internal. He said the company had an obligation to self-report. He said law enforcement would likely become involved. He said my cooperation would be documented. He also said my employment status was unchanged. That mattered more than he probably realized. Over the next month, everything slowed down and sped up at the same time. Emails were sent reminding employees about document retention. Trainings were scheduled and canceled. Meetings happened behind closed doors. Executives stopped walking the floor. In early June 2024, 2 agents from a federal investigative unit arrived at the building. They checked in with security. They were escorted upstairs. I wasn't called in immediately. They started with IT. By the end of the day, devices were collected. Servers were mirrored. Access logs were pulled. The following morning, I was interviewed. It took place in conference room 14D on the 14th floor. No windows, neutral walls, a recording device on the table. They identified themselves. They explained my rights. They explained the scope. They asked about my role, my history, my interactions with David. They asked when I first noticed irregularities. They asked what instructions I had received. They asked about the email. I answered carefully, honestly, without speculation. The interview lasted 4 hours. When it ended, they thanked me and told me not to discuss the investigation. I went back to my desk. Work was still waiting. People still needed files. Clients still had deadlines. The company still operated. David's office remained dark. And for the first time since I had joined the company, I understood something clearly. This wasn't going to end quickly. By the time the federal investigators finished their first round of interviews, the company had stopped pretending this was a contained issue. They never said that out loud. No one sent an email admitting anything. But the signals were there if you knew how to read them. Entire teams were told to pause certain workflows. Client communications were routed through legal. Compliance approvals that used to take hours now took days. I stayed in my role. That part surprised people. I was still compliance operations manager. My access was reduced, but not eliminated. I was still expected to process files, respond to clients, and support audits. No one thanked me. No one blamed me either. I existed in a kind of professional limbo where I was useful, but no longer invisible. 2 weeks after the federal interview, I was asked to come back to conference room 12A. This time the meeting invite included a location note, secure session. When I arrived, there were 4 people present. Karen from internal audit, Mark from outside counsel, a senior executive from headquarters in New York City, and someone new. He introduced himself as Special Agent Thomas Avery, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Chicago Field Office. He spoke calmly. No intimidation. No raised voice. He explained that they were conducting a formal investigation into potential violations of federal law, including wire fraud and obstruction. He said my name had come up frequently in documentation review. He was careful with his wording. I noticed that immediately. He asked me to confirm my employment status. He asked whether I had been promised anything in exchange for cooperation. He asked whether anyone had instructed me to withhold information. I said no. He asked me to describe the culture of decision-making in my department, how approvals worked, how dissent was handled. I described it factually. I didn't editorialize. I explained how authority flowed downward. I explained how verbal instructions replaced written ones over time. I explained how urgency was used to bypass procedure. He asked me whether I believed the actions taken were accidental. I said no. That was the first time I said it out loud to someone outside the company. After that meeting, things moved faster. Within days, the company issued a formal disclosure to regulators. The wording was cautious. It referenced potential irregularities and voluntary cooperation. It did not name individuals. Clients began asking questions. I was copied on emails from procurement departments in Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania asking for clarification on past certifications. Legal drafted responses. I was instructed not to answer directly. David was still on administrative leave. No one mentioned him by name. In late June 2024, Internal Audit requested a complete timeline of my involvement with specific accounts. They asked for dates, actions, approvals. I spent 3 days reconstructing my work history from logs and emails. I stuck to verifiable facts. No assumptions. No interpretations. While I was doing that, something else happened. I received an automated calendar notification. David had attempted to access the system. IT flagged it. Access was denied. The alert was logged. That detail later mattered more than I realized. In early July, outside counsel expanded their review to include executive communications. That was when the tone shifted inside the building. Senior leadership started coming to Chicago from New York and Boston. Closed-door meetings occupied the larger conference rooms. Assistants whispered. HR stopped smiling. One afternoon, I was asked to step into a smaller meeting room near the break area. It wasn't on my calendar. The head of HR was there. So was Mark. They told me they needed to ask about interactions I had not yet disclosed. They slid a printed email across the table. It wasn't one I had seen before. It was from David to a vice president in New York. It referenced operational flexibility and managing audit optics. It discussed shielding certain data from routine review cycles. It referenced me indirectly as the operator. I recognized the language. I had lived inside it for years. They asked whether I was aware of this communication. I said no. They asked whether I had ever been instructed by anyone other than David to alter records. I thought carefully. Then I answered honestly. There had been one time. A senior manager from headquarters had joined a call regarding a delayed shipment out of Toledo, Ohio. The documentation was incomplete. The manager had said, "We need this to look resolved before the end of the quarter." David had interpreted that statement as approval. I had followed David's instruction. I explained that. No one reacted. They took notes. That was when I understood this investigation was no longer focused on one director. In mid-July, federal investigators returned. This time, they didn't just collect data. They collected devices. They went floor by floor. They knocked on doors. They asked employees to step away from their desks. They placed evidence tags on laptops and phones. When they reached my desk, Agent Avery nodded to me. He asked for my work phone. I handed it over. He did not ask for my personal phone. That distinction mattered. By the end of the day, entire sections of the network were offline. Employees were told to work remotely until further notice. The office felt hollow. The following week, arrests did not happen. That surprised people too. There was no dramatic moment. No handcuffs in the lobby. No news vans outside. Instead, subpoenas were issued. Interviews were scheduled. Lawyers got busy. David was called in for questioning. I wasn't present for that. I learned about it later through legal. He had brought an attorney. He had denied intentional wrongdoing. He had characterized decisions as good faith interpretations. The email from the consultant made that position difficult. By August 2024, the investigation had spread beyond Chicago. Federal agents traveled to Houston, Texas, to interview staff connected to the multinational client. They requested records from Monterrey, Mexico. Customs officials were contacted. Regulators coordinated. Inside the company, restructuring began quietly. Certain executives stepped down for personal reasons. A compliance committee was formed. External monitors were discussed. Through all of it, I kept working. My role changed subtly. I was no longer asked to adjust anything. I was asked to document everything. I became a reference point, a living index of how things had been done. People were careful around me, not hostile, just cautious. In September 2024, I was called back to conference room 14D for a follow-up interview with federal investigators. This one was shorter, more focused. They asked whether I had ever been compensated or promised compensation for altering records. I said no. They asked whether I believed the company benefited financially from the actions taken. I said yes. They asked whether I believed David acted alone. I paused. Then I answered carefully. I said he acted within a system that rewarded outcomes over compliance. Agent Avery nodded. He didn't challenge that. At the end of the interview, he told me something I hadn't heard before. He said arrests, if they happened, would not be immediate. He said these cases took time. He said the evidence trail was strong, but complex. He said my cooperation had been noted. He did not say what that meant. In October 2024, an internal memo went out confirming that David Keller was no longer employed by the company. No explanation was given. 2 weeks later, I received a subpoena. It wasn't alarming. I had been expecting it. It requested documents and testimony related to compliance practices between 2021 and 2024. Legal reviewed it with me. They explained the process. They assured me my position was secure. I noticed they used the word position, not job. By November, the story had reached the board. By December, it reached law enforcement leadership. And by the end of the year, the company I had worked for quietly, loyally, and carefully for 3 years was no longer in control of what happened next. I was still employed. I was still reporting to work. And every day, I walked past David's empty office, knowing that the silence I had once mistaken for safety had finally run out. By January 2025, the investigation stopped being something that lived quietly inside conference rooms. It didn't explode into public view all at once. It leaked out in controlled increments, the way corporate damage always does. Carefully, strategically, just enough to satisfy disclosure requirements without inviting attention. The first sign was a filing, a routine-looking amendment attached to a quarterly report, posted late on a Friday afternoon. It referenced an ongoing federal investigation into historical compliance practices. It acknowledged potential financial exposure. It emphasized cooperation. No names, no dates, no admissions. Inside the company, the reaction was immediate. Legal scheduled mandatory briefings. Compliance issued revised protocols. HR reminded everyone about media policies. Executives began using phrases like legacy issues and prior leadership decisions. I was not mentioned. I was also not removed. That distinction mattered more every week. In early February, I was asked to relocate desks. Not to a different floor, just further away from my old team. I was moved closer to compliance oversight near a cluster of small offices used by auditors and visiting counsel. No one framed it as isolation. It was positioned as efficiency. My workload shifted again. I was no longer processing active client files. Instead, I was assigned to historical reconciliation. That meant reviewing past certifications against source documentation and flagging inconsistencies. It was tedious. It was meticulous. It was exactly what investigators wanted. Every flagged item went into a shared repository accessed by internal audit, legal, and outside counsel. Every note I added was time-stamped. Every action was logged. I was building a record. At the same time, federal investigators were doing the same. In mid-February, I was contacted by an assistant U.S. attorney based in the Northern District of Illinois. The email was formal, polite, direct. They wanted to schedule a proffer session. Legal explained what that meant. I would meet with prosecutors and investigators. I would answer questions under specific protections. Nothing I said could be used against me directly, barring certain conditions. I agreed. The meeting took place in a federal building on Dearborn Street. I passed through security. I was escorted to a conference room that looked almost identical to the ones at work, except for the seal on the wall. There were 4 people present, the AUSA, 2 federal agents, and my company's attorney. They asked me to recount events again, from the beginning. This time, they weren't just listening for facts. They were testing consistency. They were mapping intent. They were evaluating credibility. They asked about emails, spreadsheets, verbal instructions, executive tone. They asked whether I had ever questioned legality internally. I told them I had indirectly. They asked why I hadn't escalated sooner. I told them the truth. Because escalation without proof felt like career suicide, and because the culture did not reward hesitation. They didn't argue with that. They asked whether I believed David understood the criminal implications of his actions. I said yes. They asked whether I believed anyone above him did. I said I couldn't know for sure, but that certain language suggested awareness of risk. They thanked me. They said they might need me again. When I returned to work the next day, my badge still worked. My email still functioned. My desk was still there. But something had changed. People had started to read the filings. By March, industry publications picked up the story, not in headlines, in footnotes. Articles about regulatory enforcement trends referenced an unnamed logistics compliance firm in Chicago cooperating with federal authorities. Clients noticed. I was CC'd on an email from a procurement director in Columbus, Ohio, asking whether previous certifications were still valid. Legal drafted the response. I was asked to confirm technical accuracy. That was new. In the past, I had been shielded from client-facing clarification once things escalated. Now, my input was necessary. I was the institutional memory they needed. In April 2025, federal agents returned again, this time with warrants, not for arrests, for records. They served them on site. IT complied. More data was seized. More interviews were scheduled. David was not present. He had been interviewed multiple times by then. I knew that from legal. What I didn't know was how cooperative he had been. I learned that later. In May, I received another subpoena. This one was narrower. It requested testimony related to a specific set of transactions involving the multinational client. The same client that had first triggered my concern. The same shipments routed through Texas and into Mexico. The testimony was scheduled for June. By then, the internal mood had shifted from fear to fatigue. People were tired of waiting, tired of uncertainty, tired of acting like nothing was wrong while knowing something very much was. In early June, I was called into a meeting with a senior executive from headquarters, someone I had never spoken to before. The meeting took place in a small office on the 12th floor. He thanked me for my professionalism. He acknowledged that the past year had been difficult. He told me the company appreciated my cooperation and my discretion. He did not apologize. He did not promise anything. He did tell me that the company intended to weather the investigation and move forward. I understood what he was really saying. They needed me where I was. My testimony took place in a federal office building near the Chicago Loop. It was recorded, sworn, structured. I answered questions for hours. At one point, the USA asked me to read a paragraph from an email aloud. It was David's, the one where he described keeping certain adjustments below review thresholds. Hearing it out loud in that room, stripped of context and justification, made it sound exactly like what it was. Intent. By late June 2025, charges were prepared. I didn't learn that from an announcement. I learned it from a scheduling change. Federal agents requested availability dates. Prosecutors asked for confirmation on document chains. Legal grew very quiet. In July, the first arrest happened. Not in Chicago. In Houston. A senior operations manager connected to the multinational client was taken into custody on charges related to falsified customs documentation. The news didn't mention our company by name, but internally everyone knew. David was arrested 3 weeks later. It happened early in the morning. At his home in Naperville, Illinois, agents executed a warrant. Devices were seized. He was charged with wire fraud and obstruction. I learned about it from an internal legal update, not from him. By the end of the week, 2 more individuals were charged. 1 former executive, 1 external consultant. The company issued a statement. It emphasized cooperation. It emphasized accountability. It emphasized that the individuals charged were no longer employed. I read it at my desk, the same desk I had been sitting at for years. I was still employed. The investigation wasn't over. The fallout had just begun. Once the arrest started, the company stopped trying to manage perception and focused entirely on survival. Court dates were scheduled quietly. Legal calendars filled months in advance. Every decision began with one question: how does this look on the record? I was no longer invited to strategy meetings. I was consulted. There's a difference. By August 2025, my days were split between 2 tasks: historical reconciliation and witness preparation. Not my own preparation, but support for legal as they assembled timelines, verified documents, and checked consistency across testimony. I became a reference point again. Not because I wanted to be, because there were fewer people left who could explain how things had actually worked. David's case moved first. The indictment laid everything out in language that stripped away corporate euphemisms. It listed altered records, misrepresented certifications, deliberate concealment. It cited emails. It cited spreadsheets. Some of them were mine. Not my words. My edits. My timestamps. My login. Legal explained this to me carefully. They told me I was not a target. They told me my cooperation mattered. They told me intent was the line. Intent had always been the line. I continued working. That part confused people outside the company. Friends I hadn't spoken to in months would text me when they saw articles circulate through industry newsletters. They asked if I was okay. They asked if I was still there. I was. In September, I was called to testify before a grand jury. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices. No confrontations. Just a room, a court reporter, and a series of questions designed to lock facts into place. They asked about dates, approvals, processes. They asked whether I understood at the time that altering records could violate federal law. I said yes. They asked why I did it anyway. I answered honestly, because the system made it seem normal, because leadership framed it as necessary, because dissent felt riskier than compliance. No one argued. After that testimony, something shifted internally. I noticed it in the way legal interacted with me. Less guidance, more distance, not hostility, caution. I was no longer just a cooperating employee. I was now a documented witness. That status follows you. In October, the company announced a compliance overhaul. New leadership, new protocols, external oversight. There was a town hall meeting. Executives spoke about ethics, about lessons learned, about rebuilding trust. I sat in the back of the auditorium on the 8th floor and listened. No one mentioned the people who had carried out instructions. No one mentioned the culture that rewarded silence. By November, plea negotiations were underway. David's attorney contacted prosecutors. Discussions happened. Charges were refined. I was asked to review transcripts, to confirm whether statements aligned with reality. Some did, some didn't. David claimed he believed adjustments were lawful. He claimed pressure from executives. He claimed he never intended to deceive regulators. The emails contradicted him. The consultant's message contradicted him. The spreadsheets contradicted him. In December 2025, David entered a plea. Guilty. Wire fraud. Obstruction. The plea agreement referenced coordination with subordinates, but did not name me. I read it twice. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt tired. The company issued another statement. It expressed disappointment. It reaffirmed commitment to ethics. It moved on. I didn't, because the case wasn't finished. Other defendants were still contesting charges. Trials were scheduled for early 2026, and I was still employed. January came. Then February. I watched colleagues quietly leave. Some transferred. Some resigned. Some were let go as part of restructuring. I stayed, not because I was protected, because I was useful. By March 2026, the first trial began. I wasn't called immediately. I sat at my desk and worked while testimony unfolded downtown. Legal updated me when necessary. They asked me to be available. I listened to coverage later. Dry reporting. Procedural language. No drama. In April, I was called to testify, this time in open court. I wore the same navy blazer. I answered the same questions. I didn't look at David. When it was over, I went back to work. No one clapped. No one congratulated me. My inbox was full. By May, verdicts came in. Convictions, sentences were scheduled. The company's name appeared more frequently in coverage now, always paired with words like cooperation and reforms. It survived. In June, legal met with me one final time. They thanked me again. They told me my role in the process was concluding. They told me my employment status remained unchanged. I understood what that meant. The institution had absorbed the shock. It had shed individuals. It had adjusted procedures, and it was moving forward. I was still there, still working on compliance, still walking past empty offices, still aware that accountability, when it comes, is rarely neat. By the time sentencing dates were set, the company had already begun acting like the chapter was closed. New leadership was in place. Compliance dashboards were redesigned. Outside monitors occupied offices on the 12th floor, rotating in and out with clipped badges and limited small talk. The language inside the building shifted. People stopped saying before and started saying under the old structure. I was still there. I had a new reporting line now. No director. No single authority. Compliance oversight worked through committees. Everything required documentation. Everything required consensus. Nothing moved quickly anymore. That was the point. In July 2026, sentencing memoranda were filed. I read them the way I had read everything else in the past 3 years, carefully, looking for what was said and what wasn't. David's memorandum emphasized pressure, culture, ambiguity. It referenced company expectations. It framed decisions as cumulative misjudgments rather than deliberate acts. It asked for leniency. The government's response was precise. It cited emails. It cited timelines. It cited coordination. It emphasized that the conduct was sustained, intentional, and concealed. It referenced me only as a cooperating employee. I was not asked to submit a statement. I was relieved by that. Sentencing took place on a Tuesday morning in a federal courtroom downtown. I did not attend. Legal advised against it. There was no requirement. David was sentenced to prison. Not a long sentence. Not a symbolic one either. Enough to be real. I learned the details from a legal summary circulated later that day. The email was neutral, informational. It ended with a reminder about document retention policies. Life at the office continued. The external monitor requested additional reviews. Clients requested updated certifications. New audits were scheduled. In August, I was assigned to help onboard a new compliance software platform. It tracked changes automatically. It flagged deviations. It required written justification for every override. It was everything the old system hadn't been. I trained people on it. That irony wasn't lost on me. People ask questions differently now. They documented concerns. They escalated early. They were cautious. Sometimes they were afraid. In September, the final trial concluded. Convictions were secured. One acquittal surprised everyone. Another plea followed. The company issued its final disclosure related to the investigation. It acknowledged wrongdoing. It outlined penalties. It detailed reforms. The stock dipped, then recovered. The institution moved on. I stayed in my role. At some point, someone from HR asked me whether I wanted to explore growth opportunities. The phrasing was careful. The implication was not. I told them I was focused on my current responsibilities. That was true. I wasn't waiting for redemption. I wasn't waiting for recognition. I was waiting for quiet. In October, the external monitor scheduled an exit review. They interviewed dozens of employees. When they interviewed me, they asked one question that no one else had asked before. They asked whether I would do anything differently. I answered honestly. I said I would have documented earlier. They asked why I hadn't. I said because documentation felt dangerous when the culture punished it. They wrote that down. By November, the monitor's term ended. Their office emptied. The 12th floor regained its usual quiet. Thanksgiving came and went. Then December. 3 years had passed since the first time I adjusted a record without documentation. 2 years since I read the email. 1 year since the first arrest. I was still employed. On the last workday before the holidays, I sat at my desk and watched the city through the glass. The river was gray. The offices across the way were half-lit. People were leaving early. I thought about how close silence and loyalty can feel. How easily one turns into the other. How systems don't need bad people to break the law. They just need people who don't want to be the first to speak. I shut down my computer and walked to the elevator. The lobby was decorated for the season. Security wished me a good holiday. Outside, Chicago was cold and ordinary. Nothing about my life looked dramatic from the outside. And that was the point. The consequences hadn't been loud. They had been procedural, slow, administrative. They had unfolded while I stayed exactly where I was. By the time the legal aftermath settled into paperwork and precedent, the company had learned how to speak about what happened without saying anything meaningful. They called it a chapter. They called it a lesson. They called it a turning point. Inside the building on South Wacker Drive, it felt more like sediment. Everything had sunk to the bottom and hardened. The shape of the place was the same, but the weight had changed. I was still there. In January 2027, The Department of Justice issued its final public statement regarding the investigation. It outlined the scope. It detailed the penalties. It confirmed ongoing compliance obligations. It closed the matter. That phrase appeared more than once. For the company, the matter was closed. For the individuals who had been charged, it had become a permanent part of their lives. For the people who had followed instructions without understanding where they led, it was something quieter. It was residue. I noticed it in small ways. In meetings, people no longer spoke in hypotheticals. They asked for written confirmation. They paused before agreeing to anything that wasn't explicitly documented. Silence, once a form of loyalty, had become a liability. That shift didn't come from ethics training. It came from watching what happened. New hires were on board with stories stripped of names and specifics. Before the changes, someone would say, under the old system, the narrative was controlled. I was occasionally asked to speak during those sessions, not about the investigation, about procedures, about escalation, about why documentation mattered. I never volunteered more than I was asked. I didn't want to become a symbol. In February, I received an internal performance review. It was thorough, complimentary, careful. It praised my professionalism, my resilience, my commitment to process integrity. It did not mention the investigation. At the end, my manager asked if I had any concerns. I said no. That wasn't entirely true. But some concerns don't belong in forms. Around that time, I learned that David had begun serving his sentence. I didn't hear it from legal. I heard it indirectly, through a former colleague who still spoke to someone connected to his family. There was no satisfaction in that knowledge, no sense of balance, just confirmation. In March, the company's compliance certification was renewed. It was a milestone. Leadership celebrated it internally. Emails went out congratulating teams. The tone was optimistic. I read them at my desk. The certification referenced strengthened controls, enhanced oversight, cultural reform. It did not reference the people who had made those changes necessary. I stayed, not because I owed the company anything, not because I believed it deserved loyalty, because leaving would have felt like rewriting the story in a way that wasn't honest. The truth was, I hadn't been forced to stay silent. I had chosen silence because it felt safer. That distinction mattered to me. In April, an external recruiter reached out. The message was vague. A compliance role, competitive compensation, discretion assured. I didn't respond. I wasn't ready to be elsewhere. By May, the pace of work normalized. Audits came and went. Reviews were thorough but predictable. The sense of constant vigilance softened into routine. The building felt like it had before. Clean, orderly, professional. Only now, everyone knew what could happen behind closed doors. I thought often about the email. Not the words themselves, but the moment I read them. How nothing had changed around me. How the office had continued to hum. How the decision I made in that moment had set everything else in motion without anyone noticing. That's how accountability usually starts. Quietly, in someone else's inbox. In June, I was asked to help draft a new internal reporting guideline. It outlined when and how concerns should be escalated. It emphasized protections. It emphasized documentation. As I reviewed the language, I recognized how careful it was. How many of its sentences were designed to reassure people who were afraid of doing exactly what I hadn't done soon enough. I suggested minor edits, clarifications, nothing dramatic. The guideline was approved. In July, the company held another town hall. This one was about the future, growth, expansion, rebuilding trust with clients. I sat in the same seat I had occupied years earlier, listening to a different set of executives speak about transparency. They meant it. That didn't make it simpler. After the meeting, I walked back to my desk and looked at the skyline. The river moved the same way it always had. The city didn't remember what had happened in that building. Institutions rarely do. People do. I remained employed. I remained quiet. I remained aware. The consequences had unfolded. The system had absorbed them. The story was nearly over. What remained was the waiting, not for justice, that had already happened in its own limited way, but for meaning. And meaning doesn't arrive with verdicts. Nothing ended with a moment that felt final. There was no last meeting, no closing email, no clear signal that everything had been resolved. The cases concluded, the filing stopped, and the attention moved on. That was it. I was still employed. On a Monday morning in early autumn, I sat at my desk on the 8th floor and reviewed a routine compliance report for a client in Peoria, Illinois. The numbers matched. The documentation was complete. The approval trail was clean. I submitted it and moved on to the next file. That was my life now. Ordinary work inside a company that had survived something it would never fully discuss. People assume that accountability feels like closure, that once arrests happen and sentences are handed down, the weight lifts, that there's a clean emotional arc. I didn't experience that. What I experienced was continuity. The same badge still opened the doors. The same security guards still nodded. The same elevators still stopped on the same floors. New names occupied old offices. New language replaced old excuses. But the structure remained. And so did I. Sometimes I wondered what it would have looked like if I had spoken up earlier. Not in a dramatic way. Not with accusations. Just documentation. A question asked in writing. A follow-up email sent instead of a verbal agreement. I didn't dwell on it constantly. Regret that becomes obsessive isn't useful, but I didn't erase it either. It stayed with me as a reference point. The truth is, I didn't think I was doing anything extraordinary when I stayed silent. I thought I was being practical. I thought I was protecting my job. I thought I was helping the company function. I wasn't thinking about wire fraud statutes or obstruction charges. I was thinking about deadlines, about performance reviews, about being seen as difficult in a system that punished friction. That's how these things happen. Not through villains who announce themselves, through routines that drift, through language that softens reality, through people who don't want to be the one who slows everything down. When I finally did speak, it wasn't courage that pushed me. It was evidence. It was an email that removed all ambiguity. Once intent was written down, silence stopped being neutral. After that, the machinery took over. Investigators did what they do. Lawyers argued. Judges ruled. Executives repositioned. The company paid fines and moved forward. The industry absorbed the lesson in the abstract. And I stayed. There were days I considered leaving. Not for a better job. Not for a fresh start. Just to put distance between myself and the building where everything had happened. But leaving would have felt like editing the ending. The truth was, I had helped create the situation that later required accountability. Not alone. Not maliciously. But measurably. My work was part of the record. My silence was part of the timeline. Staying meant I had to live with that without rewriting it. Now, when new employees ask about escalation, I don't give speeches. I don't warn them dramatically. I tell them exactly how the process works. I tell them where to document. I tell them which words matter. I tell them that if something feels off, they should put it in writing and keep a copy. I don't say why. They don't need the story. They need the mechanism. Occasionally, someone asks me if it was hard to testify, if it was frightening to talk to federal investigators, if it changed me. I answer honestly. The hardest part wasn't the interviews. It wasn't the courtroom. It wasn't even watching someone I worked with go to prison. The hardest part was realizing how long I had mistaken loyalty for responsibility. Those two things are not the same. Loyalty protects people. Responsibility protects systems. Silence protects outcomes until it doesn't. I still work in compliance. I still review documents. I still sit in meetings where decisions are framed carefully. I still hear language that edges toward convenience. The difference now is that I know exactly where that edge leads. Nothing about my life looks dramatic. I didn't become a whistleblower figure. I didn't give interviews. I didn't leave the company. I didn't rebuild myself somewhere else. I stayed. And every day, I carry the quiet knowledge of how close ordinary work can come to something criminal when no one stops it early. That's the part people don't like to talk about. Not the arrests, not the headlines, the waiting, the normalization, the years that pass before anyone realizes how far things have drifted. So when you hear stories like this and wonder why someone didn't speak up sooner, ask a harder question. Ask what made silence feel safer than documentation. Ask what incentives were in place. Ask how many people were involved before intent ever appeared in writing. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to please subscribe for more workplace drama stories that unfold just like this. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. And ask yourself this, honestly. If you were in that office, under that pressure, with that much at stake, at what point would you have stopped? Because I thought I knew my answer, until the email proved I didn't. And that's what I still think about, sitting at the same desk, inside the same company, long after the consequences have finished unfolding.